My name is Sarah, and I've been in a relationship with Mike for 20 years. We met when we were young, full of dreams, and ready to take on the world together. Over the years, we've built a life, a house, careers, and a family with 3 wonderful children. On the surface, it looks like everything someone could want. But deep down, I've felt a growing sense of unease, a quiet dissatisfaction that's become harder to ignore. Mike and I are not married. For me, this has always been important. Not just the ceremony, but the shared commitment, the symbolic act of taking his name, and the sense of unity it represents. For him, it's always been something else. A task for another day, an idea he seemed reluctant to embrace. When we were younger, he used to joke about it, calling our relationship a contract he never remembered signing. At the time, I laughed along, thinking it was just his quirky sense of humor. But now, those words echo differently. As the years went on, I convinced myself that patience was the key. He often reassured me that marriage was just around the corner, and I clung to that hope. Life carried us forward, jobs, bills, and eventually children. But that promise lingered in the background, unfulfilled. Now, 2 decades later, I find myself questioning everything. How did we get here? How did I end up feeling so disconnected from the person I once loved so deeply? I want to believe that there's still something worth saving, but I also can't ignore the ache of being unheard. This isn't where I imagined I'd be after 20 years with someone I thought was my forever. I met Mike when I was 20, and he was 19. We were young and carefree, navigating life with a sense of adventure. He had this charm about him, an easygoing confidence that made everything feel light and fun. Our connection was instant, the kind that made the rest of the world fade away when we were together. It wasn't long before I realized I wanted to build a life with him. Back then, everything felt simple. We'd talk for hours about our dreams, traveling, building a home, starting a family. I remember the way he'd look at me, as if I was the center of his world. It was intoxicating. In those moments, it felt like nothing could ever come between us. From the very beginning, I was open about what I wanted in life, especially when it came to marriage. It wasn't just about the wedding or the party. It was about the commitment, the partnership, and yes, the shared last name. For me, it symbolized unity. I wanted to be a family in every sense of the word. Mike would smile when I brought it up. "We'll get there," he'd say, or sometimes, "It's just a piece of paper. We're already committed." Then there were his jokes, those lighthearted comments about being in a contract he didn't remember signing. I brushed them off, thinking they were harmless. After all, actions spoke louder than words, and his actions showed he cared. Or so I thought. Looking back, maybe I should have seen the signs. But at 20, I was full of optimism. I believed that love could overcome anything, that time would smooth out the bumps. We were happy. And in my mind, that was enough. The rest would come naturally, right? In those early years, Mike and I built our relationship on shared dreams. We'd stay up late talking about the life we wanted, where we'd live, the adventures we'd go on, the family we'd create together. He had this way of making the future feel limitless, like anything was possible as long as we were together. I cherish those conversations because they made me believe we were on the same page. I often brought up marriage during those talks, weaving it into our vision of the future. For me, it was a natural part of the life we were building, a milestone that would cement our bond. Mike would nod along, his responses casual but reassuring. "Of course," he'd say, "when the time's right." It wasn't a firm promise, but I took it as one. Back then, I trusted his word without hesitation. As we settled into our lives together, those dreams started to take shape. We rented our first apartment, cobbling together furniture from thrift stores and hand-me-downs. We took road trips, explored new places, and spent lazy Sundays imagining what our forever home might look like. Every step felt like progress, and I clung to the belief that marriage would eventually fit into the picture. But as the years went by, something shifted. The casual assurances started to feel less like promises and more like deflections. The conversations about marriage became shorter, often brushed aside with a joke or a change of subject. Still, I told myself to be patient. We were building something beautiful, and I didn't want to ruin it by pushing too hard. I thought that if I gave it time, everything would fall into place. After all, we were happy, weren't we? When I found out I was pregnant with our first child, Ethan, I was overjoyed. It felt like a new chapter, one that would bring us closer together as a family. Mike was thrilled, too. He'd always been great with kids, and I could already picture him as a doting father. We spent months preparing, decorating the nursery, picking out names, and dreaming about the life we'd create for our little boy. Ethan's arrival was everything I'd hoped for. Holding him in my arms for the first time, I felt an overwhelming sense of love and purpose. Watching Mike with him made my heart swell. He was so attentive, so eager to embrace his role as a dad. In those early weeks, we were a team, tackling sleepless nights and diaper changes together. It felt like we were stronger than ever. But amidst the joy, the subject of marriage lingered in the back of my mind. I wanted our family to share a last name, to have that visible bond of unity. I brought it up gently, hoping the timing was right now that we had a child. Mike listened but didn't engage the way I'd hoped. "Let's not rush things," he said. "We've got enough on our plates right now." I tried to push the disappointment aside, focusing instead on the happiness Ethan had brought into our lives. Parenthood was new and all-consuming, and I convinced myself that the rest could wait. After all, Mike was a wonderful partner and father. Maybe that was enough. Still, every time I filled out a form or introduced myself as Ethan's mother, the absence of our shared name stung. It was a small thing, perhaps, but to me it represented something much bigger, a sense of belonging, of being truly seen as a family, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore it. When Ethan was 3, Mike came to me with an idea that caught me off guard. He wanted to change careers, completely. At the time, he had a stable job that provided for us comfortably, but he wasn't happy. "I need something more fulfilling," he told me one night after Ethan had gone to bed. "Something that makes me feel alive." I listened as he laid out his plan. It wasn't just a change, it was a leap. The new field he wanted to pursue offered lower pay, longer hours, and more risk. It wasn't an easy sell, especially with a young child at home and another baby on the horizon. News I hadn't yet shared with him. My first instinct was to say no. It felt reckless, and I worried about the toll it might take on our family. But Mike was persistent. He spoke with a passion I hadn't seen in years, and he promised it would be worth it in the long run. "I'll make it work," he said. "I just need you to believe in me." I wanted to support him. He had always been the one to dream big, and I didn't want to be the reason he held back. After weeks of deliberation, I agreed. The transition wasn't easy. There were sacrifices, tight budgets, less time together, more stress. I tried to focus on the positives, reminding myself that this was something important to him, but deep down, a part of me wondered when it would be my turn. I had compromised so much, and yet the one thing I wanted, a commitment, a simple yes. Not long after Mike began his new career, I discovered I was pregnant again. The timing felt both exciting and daunting. We were still adjusting to the changes in his work life, but I couldn't help feeling a spark of hope. Maybe this new chapter would bring us closer together. Another child meant another chance to grow as a family and deepen our connection. When Emma was born, she brought so much light into our lives. Watching Ethan become a big brother melted my heart, and Mike seemed equally taken by her. He'd cradle her in his arms, singing softly, while Ethan stood nearby, curious and eager to help. It was moments like those that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with him. Amidst the joy, though, the familiar ache returned. With 2 children now, my longing for us to officially become a family in every sense grew stronger. I felt a renewed urgency to bring up the idea of marriage, thinking that the arrival of our daughter might shift his perspective. Surely now he would see the importance of making that commitment. When I raised the subject, Mike's response was the same as before. Calm, dismissive, almost rehearsed. "We're already a family," he said. "A piece of paper doesn't change that." I tried to explain that for me. It wasn't just about the paper. It was about feeling unified, having the same name as our children, and knowing that we were in this together, fully and officially. But no matter how carefully I chose my words, it didn't seem to resonate with him. I buried my disappointment and focused on our growing family. Life was busy, and there wasn't much time to dwell on what was missing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. That no matter how much I gave, the one thing I truly needed continued to be just out of reach. Life with 2 small children was a whirlwind. Between sleepless nights, diaper changes, and managing Ethan's newfound energy as a toddler, our days were packed from morning to night. Mike was often busy with his new career, working long hours and adjusting to the demands of his job. It wasn't easy, but I tried to maintain a sense of balance for our growing family. Our routines became second nature. Meals, bath time, bedtime stories. Ethan loved being the big brother, proudly showing off Emma to anyone who visited. Emma, in turn, was the center of everyone's attention, her wide eyes and tiny giggles lighting up the room. I cherished these moments, clinging to the joy they brought amid the chaos. But as our family life evolved, I couldn't help noticing a subtle shift in my relationship with Mike. We weren't connecting the way we used to. Conversations became functional, about groceries, bills, and schedules. There was little time, or perhaps little effort, for the deeper talks we once had late into the night. I told myself it was just the stress of this stage of life. Raising young kids was demanding, and we were both stretched thin. Still, I couldn't ignore the growing distance. The unspoken tension was creeping into our interactions, and the issue of marriage lingered quietly in the background. I hesitated to bring it up again, afraid of another dismissive response. Instead, I threw myself into the busyness of motherhood, telling myself that these early years with Ethan and Emma were fleeting and that my focus needed to be on them. Yet, in the quiet moments after the kids were asleep, I'd feel the weight of what was missing, a partnership that felt equal, where my feelings and needs mattered as much as his. As the years went by, I started noticing a pattern. Every time I brought up marriage, Mike would respond with the same casual assurances. "It'll happen soon," he'd say, or "Don't worry about it, it's just around the corner." At first, I believed him. I wanted to believe him. After all, we had built a life together, and I didn't want to question the foundation of what we had. But the more I waited, the more those words began to feel hollow. Each passing year made his promises seem less like commitments and more like ways to placate me. It wasn't just the lack of follow-through that hurt. It was the sense that something so important to me didn't matter to him in the same way. I tried different approaches to bring it up. Sometimes I'd ask directly, "When do you think we'll finally make it official?" Other times, I'd try to frame it as a shared milestone, something we could celebrate together. But no matter how I approached the subject, the outcome was always the same. Vague answers, jokes to deflect, or outright dismissal. Over time, it started to chip away at me. I began questioning whether I was asking for too much, whether my expectations were unreasonable. But deep down, I knew they weren't. I wasn't asking for a grand gesture or an elaborate wedding. I just wanted to feel like my needs and desires mattered, like the commitment I had given to him over the years was being returned in kind. What made it worse was that I had been so supportive of his dreams, his career change, his goals, his vision for our future. I had been willing to sacrifice for him, time and again. And yet, the one thing I had consistently asked for seemed to remain perpetually out of reach. The imbalance was becoming impossible to ignore. When the pandemic hit, our world, like everyone else's, turned upside down. Overnight, life became a blur of uncertainty and adjustment. Ethan and Emma were suddenly home full-time, and Mike's work became even more demanding, with unpredictable hours and constant stress. The days were long, the nights restless, and our usual routines were thrown into chaos. Amid all this, I discovered I was pregnant with our third child. It was unexpected, something we hadn't planned, but once the shock wore off, I began to feel a quiet excitement. A new baby meant a fresh beginning, a reason to hope during such a difficult time. I imagined that this might bring us closer as a family, a silver lining in the midst of so much upheaval. When Lily was born, She was a source of light in a very dark year. Her arrival brought moments of joy and connection that we desperately needed. Ethan and Emma were smitten with their baby sister, and for a little while, it felt like the challenges of the outside world faded into the background. Still, as happy as I was to welcome Lily, the familiar ache crept back in. I thought that surely, with 3 children now, Mike might finally see the importance of marriage, the unity and sense of belonging I had been yearning for. So, once again, I brought it up, cautiously testing the waters. His response was dismissive, almost cold. "It's just not a priority for me," he said. The words hit me like a brick. After everything we had been through together, everything I had done to support him, it was hard not to feel like my feelings didn't matter. I wanted to argue, to make him see why this was so important to me, but instead, I swallowed my hurt and let the conversation drop, retreating into myself once again. One of the hardest things for me about not being married to Mike is the surname issue. It might sound trivial to some, but to me, it's deeply personal. Ethan, Emma, and Lily all have Mike's last name, which made sense when we were naming them. At the time, I assumed that eventually we'd share that name too, completing the picture of a unified family. But as the years passed, it became a constant reminder of something unfinished, something missing. Every time I introduce myself as their mother, there's a subtle hesitation, a pause before I give my last name. I see the looks, confusion, curiosity, as people try to piece it together. It shouldn't matter, but it does. It feels like an invisible barrier, separating me from the family I've poured my heart into building. I'm their mother, their caregiver, the one who's been there for every scraped knee and bedtime story. But on paper, I feel like an outsider. I brought this up to Mike several times, hoping he'd understand. "It's not just about a name," I explained. "It's about feeling like I'm truly part of this family we've created." But to him, it was a non-issue. "You're already their mom," he'd say. "Why does a name change that?" His inability, or unwillingness, to see how much this meant to me was crushing. It wasn't just about the name. It was about what it represented. Acknowledgement, equality, partnership. I wanted to feel like we were in this together, like my identity mattered as much as his. Instead, I felt sidelined, as though my desires were secondary to his convenience. The worst part was how small it made me feel. Each time the subject came up, I'd walk away feeling like I was being unreasonable, as if wanting to feel connected to my own family in this way was asking for too much. And with each passing year, the weight of that unfulfilled hope grew heavier, a constant reminder of how far apart we'd drifted. One Tatoru. After years of feeling unheard, something inside me shifted. I didn't make a conscious decision to pull away from Mike, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to check out emotionally. I stopped bringing up the topic of marriage, tired of being met with the same dismissive responses. I stopped hoping for change and instead focused on the things I could control: my kids, my home, and the day-to-day demands of our life. Our intimacy began to fade, not just physically, but in every sense. Conversations became purely functional. What time Ethan needed to be picked up, what bills were due, what groceries were running low. The easy connection we once had, the late-night talks and shared laughter, felt like a distant memory. Mike noticed, but his reaction only deepened the wedge between us. Instead of asking what was wrong or trying to bridge the gap, he moved further away. He started sleeping on the couch, saying, "Why should I hold you if you're never going to give me something in return?" His words stung, not just for their bluntness, but for the implication that our relationship had become a transaction, something to be measured in give and take. I tried to suggest counseling, thinking that maybe with the help of a professional, we could find our way back to each other, but he dismissed the idea outright. "I don't need someone else telling me how to live my life," he said. And just like that, another door closed. I wanted to fight for us, but I was exhausted. It felt like I was the only one trying, the only one who cared about saving what we had. The loneliness of sleeping alone night after night was matched only by the loneliness of feeling invisible to the person I had once loved so deeply. As the distance between Mike and me grew, I found myself searching for ways to bridge the gap. I didn't want to give up on us, not after everything we had been through together. I still loved him, or at least the version of him I used to know, and I clung to the hope that we could find our way back to that place. I started small, looking for opportunities to connect. I'd sit next to him on the couch in the evenings, hoping for a conversation or even a moment of shared silence. But he'd stay focused on his phone or the TV, barely acknowledging my presence. I tried suggesting date nights, offering to arrange a babysitter so we could have some time to ourselves, but he wasn't interested. "It's too much trouble," he'd say, brushing off the idea as if it were an inconvenience. When those efforts didn't work, I decided to be more direct. I asked him if he was happy, if he thought there was something we could do to improve our relationship. His response was frustratingly nonchalant. "I'm fine," he said with a shrug. "Things are what they are." It felt like trying to have a conversation with a wall. Desperate for something to break the stalemate, I brought up counseling again. I told him it wasn't about assigning blame or proving who was right. It was about finding a way to communicate better and understand each other. But he shut it down, just as he had before. "We don't need a therapist," he said firmly. "We just need to stop making everything such a big deal." I felt defeated, like every attempt to reconnect was met with resistance or indifference. It was becoming harder and harder to see a way forward when the person I was trying to reach didn't seem to want the same thing. Still, I couldn't let go of the hope that, somehow, we could fix what was broken. For our kids, for our family, and for the love I once believed would last forever. I've always carried a deep fear of what it means to come from a broken home. My parents divorced when I was young, and while I know they did what was best for themselves, the upheaval left scars. I remember the awkward handoffs, the missed milestones, the feeling of being caught in the middle of something I couldn't control. I promised myself that when I had a family, I'd do everything in my power to keep it whole. That promise has weighed heavily on me. It's part of the reason I've stayed with Mike for so long, despite the growing cracks in our relationship. I don't want my children, Ethan, Emma, and Lily, to feel the confusion and heartache that I once did. I don't want them to question their sense of stability or wonder why their parents couldn't make it work. But as much as I fear the idea of separating, I also worry about what staying in this relationship might teach them. I think about Ethan, watching how his father and I interact, or don't, and wonder if he'll grow up believing that this is what a partnership looks like. I think about Emma and Lily and what they might learn about how a woman's feelings and desires should be treated in a relationship. I want to give them an example of love and respect, but I'm starting to question whether I'm doing that by staying. The thought of breaking my family apart is almost unbearable, yet so is the idea of living like this indefinitely. I feel caught between two impossible choices: the fear of causing my children pain and the fear of losing myself entirely. It's a weight that I carry every day, and I'm no closer to finding an answer. Late at night, when the house is quiet and the kids are asleep, I often find myself thinking about the early days of our relationship. Back then, Mike and I were inseparable. We couldn't get enough of each other, talking for hours, laughing until our sides hurt, stealing kisses whenever we had the chance. It felt effortless, like we had discovered something rare and magical. Those memories play in my mind like an old movie, vivid and bittersweet. I remember how he used to look at me, with a spark in his eyes that made me feel like the most important person in the world. We had inside jokes, spontaneous adventures, and the kind of connection that made me believe we could weather anything. Even the tough times seemed manageable because we faced them together. When we didn't have much money, we'd still find joy in the simplest things: a walk in the park, a shared meal, or staying up late to dream about our future. Now, that version of us feels like a lifetime ago. I look at Mike and wonder where that spark went, if it's buried under years of stress and routine, or if it's simply gone. I wonder if he looks at me and remembers any of it, or if he's too far removed to care. I miss the way we used to be, the way he used to make me feel. I miss feeling wanted and valued, like my presence mattered to him. Sometimes I catch myself thinking that if we could just get back to those days, everything would be okay. But then reality creeps in, and I realize how much has changed. I can't decide if we've grown apart because life got in the way or because something fundamental about us no longer fits. Either way, the memories are both a comfort and a reminder of how far we've drifted. They make me ache for the love we once had, even as I question whether it's something we can ever find again. One of the hardest things to reconcile is the imbalance I feel in our relationship. Over the years, I've sacrificed so much for Mike, for his dreams, his comfort, his version of our life together. I've adjusted, compromised, and supported him at every turn, always believing that this is what you do for someone you love. But the more I reflect on it, the more I wonder, when has he done the same for me? It's not that I expect grand gestures or dramatic sacrifices, but there's a difference between occasional disagreements and feeling like your needs are consistently pushed aside. Every time I brought up marriage, it wasn't just about a ceremony or a name. It was about being heard, about having my feelings validated. And every time he brushed it off, it felt like another reminder that what matters to me doesn't carry the same weight for him. I think about all the times I've stood by him. When he wanted to change careers, even though it meant a pay cut and more stress, I supported him because it was important to him. When he said he needed time to figure things out, I gave him time, years of it. But when it comes to what I've asked for, there's always an excuse, always a reason why it's not the right moment. I don't want to keep score, but it's hard not to feel resentful. I want to feel like we're equal partners, like my desires and dreams are just as significant as his. Instead, I feel like I'm always the one bending, the one giving, the one waiting. I don't know how much longer I can keep doing that without losing myself in the process. I just want to feel like I matter as much to him as he does to me. If there's one thing that keeps me awake at night, it's the question of how all of this is affecting Ethan, Emma, and Lily. They're my world. The reason I push through every hard day and try to hold it all together. But as much as I want to shield them from the cracks in my relationship with Mike, I know they're perceptive. Kids have a way of picking up on things, even when we think we're hiding them. I've seen the way Ethan looks at Mike and me when we're barely speaking to each other. He's old enough to sense the tension, even if he doesn't fully understand it. Emma is starting to ask questions, small ones like why Daddy sleeps on the couch or why Mommy looks sad sometimes. And Lily, though still so young, is growing up in an environment where love feels distant, not the warm, reassuring presence it should be. I worry about what this is teaching them. Ethan idolizes his father, and I fear he might grow up thinking it's normal to dismiss someone's feelings, to avoid hard conversations instead of addressing them. I think about Emma and Lily, and whether they'll see my silence as an example of how women should suppress their needs for the sake of harmony. That thought terrifies me. I want my daughters to grow up knowing their voices matter, that their feelings should never be ignored. At the same time, the idea of breaking apart their family feels unbearable. I think about the stability they've known and how uprooting that might impact their sense of security. Would they blame me? Would they understand? I feel trapped between two impossible choices, staying in a relationship that feels hollow or risking their happiness for the chance to find my own. I know there's no perfect solution. All I want is to give them the best life possible, but I'm no longer sure if that means staying or leaving. Either way, I worry that the weight of my choices will shape their future, for better or worse. As I've struggled with my own feelings, I've found myself reflecting more and more on Mike's choices over the years. It's not that I blame him entirely for where we are. I know relationships are complicated, and both people contribute to their success or failure. But it's hard not to feel like he's been steering the ship while I've been left trying to keep it afloat. I think about the decisions he's made and how often they've prioritized his wants and needs. When he decided to change careers, I supported him, even though it meant sacrifices for our family. When he wanted to delay marriage, I put my feelings aside because I believed him when he said it was just a matter of time. Time and time again, I've adjusted to accommodate his plans, trusting that my turn would come. But when I look back, I struggle to pinpoint moments where he's done the same for me. The things that matter most to me, marriage, a sense of unity, feeling like an equal partner, seem to have always taken a backseat to his priorities. It's not that he's a bad person. He's just always seemed so sure that his way is the right way, that what he values should naturally be what we all value. I wonder if he even realizes how much I've given up along the way. Does he see the nights I've spent crying alone, the resentment building silently while I try to keep the peace? I've always believed that love is about compromise. But what happens when one person does all the compromising? These thoughts have been weighing on me more and more, and I can't shake the feeling that something has to change, either in him or in me. The weight of expectations has always been heavy on my shoulders. It's not just about what Mike wants or what I want. It's about the countless voices, real and imagined, that seem to have a say in how I live my life. There's the societal narrative that says a family should stay together at all costs, that breaking up a long-term relationship is a failure. And then there's the voice in my own head, reminding me of promises I made to myself long ago. I come from a family that didn't stay together. My parents' divorce was messy and painful, and it left me with a deep-seated fear of repeating their mistakes. I swore I'd do things differently, that I'd create a stable, loving home where my children would never feel the kind of uncertainty I did. But now, I'm starting to wonder if I've taken that promise too far, if I've let it trap me in a situation where my happiness and sense of self have become secondary to an ideal that may no longer be attainable. Then there are the opinions of others, whether spoken aloud or implied through glances and whispers. I know what people might say if I left Mike, that I didn't try hard enough, that I gave up after all these years, that I'm selfish for putting my needs before my family's. The thought of being judged is overwhelming, and yet staying feels like its own kind of failure. I've spent so much time trying to live up to everyone else's expectations that I've lost sight of what I truly want, or even who I truly am. The internal battle is exhausting. On one hand, I feel a responsibility to maintain the life we've built, to keep up the appearance of a happy family for the sake of my kids and the world around me. On the other hand, I'm starting to realize that pretending to be happy isn't the same as actually being happy, and I can't help but wonder if the life I've been clinging to is worth it if I'm losing myself in the process. In my search for clarity, I've started opening up to the people closest to me, friends, family, anyone I trust enough to share the parts of my life that I usually keep hidden. It hasn't been easy. Talking about my struggles with Mike feels like admitting a failure, like pulling back the curtain on something I've tried so hard to keep private. But I've reached a point where I can't carry it alone anymore. The responses have been mixed. Some of my friends are supportive, encouraging me to prioritize my happiness. "You've given him 20 years," one of them said. "You deserve to feel valued and fulfilled." Others are more cautious, reminding me of the potential fallout for the kids, the financial challenges, the emotional toll of starting over. "Are you sure things can't be fixed?" they ask. Their concern genuine but layered with doubt. My family's reactions have been equally varied. My mom, who lived through her own divorce, has been a pillar of support. She tells me that sometimes leaving is the braver choice, that staying in an unhappy relationship can be just as damaging as walking away. My siblings, on the other hand, are more conflicted. They worry about how a separation might affect the kids, echoing the fears that already keep me up at night. The advice I've received has been helpful in some ways and overwhelming in others. Everyone seems to have an opinion, but no one has the answer, not even me. These conversations have reminded me of one thing, though. This is ultimately my decision. No one else can live my life, feel my pain, or understand the nuances of my relationship with Mike. Their input matters, but at the end of the day, the choice has to come from within me. Despite everything, I knew I had to try one more time. For the sake of our kids, for the years we'd spent together, and for the love I still held onto in some quiet corner of my heart, I decided to confront Mike again. Not with anger or frustration, but with honesty, laying it all out in the hope that he might finally see the depth of what I was feeling. One evening after the kids were in bed, I asked him to sit down with me. "I need to talk," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. He looked tired, distracted, as if he was bracing himself for another argument. But I wasn't interested in fighting. I wanted him to understand. I told him how isolated I'd been feeling, how long I'd waited for him to follow through on promises that now felt like distant echoes. I explained that it wasn't just about marriage. It was about being heard, about feeling like my needs mattered. I described the toll it had taken on me, the sleepless nights, the silent resentment, the fear that we were teaching our kids the wrong kind of love. He listened, or at least he appeared to. But when I finished, his response left me hollow. "I don't know what you want me to say," he muttered, looking down at his hands. "I'm doing the best I can." It wasn't the response I had hoped for. I wanted acknowledgement, a willingness to meet me halfway, some sign that he cared enough to try. Instead, it felt like another wall going up, another reminder of the distance between us. I don't know if it's that he doesn't understand or if he simply doesn't want to, but as I sat there, watching him retreat into himself, I felt the last threads of hope unraveling. I had given him everything I could, and I was beginning to realize that maybe it would never be enough, not because of me, but because he wasn't willing to meet me where I stood. In the aftermath of that conversation, I found myself reflecting deeply on what it means to love someone and what it means to love yourself. For so long, I've poured every ounce of myself into this relationship, into our family, into trying to make things work with Mike. But somewhere along the way, I stopped asking what I needed in return. I stopped considering whether the love I was giving was being matched by the love I was receiving. It's not easy to admit, but I've been neglecting myself. I've let my own desires and emotions take a back seat, convincing myself that as long as the kids were happy and Mike was content, my happiness didn't matter as much. But lately, I've started to wonder if that's truly sustainable. Can I keep giving from an empty cup? Can I be the mother, the partner, the person I want to be if I'm constantly suppressing my own needs? Loving yourself isn't about being selfish. It's about recognizing your own worth, about understanding that your feelings are just as valid as anyone else's. For so long, I've been afraid to demand more because I didn't want to rock the boat. But now, I'm starting to see that staying silent has only led to resentment and a growing sense of loss, not just of my relationship, but of myself. I've been holding on to the idea that love means sacrifice. And while that's true to a point, it can't be one-sided. Real love, I think, is about balance. It's about two people lifting each other up, meeting each other's needs, and growing together. If that balance isn't there, what's left? And if I'm not willing to love and value myself, how can I expect anyone else to do the same? As the weeks went by, the weight of my decision loomed larger than ever. I spent countless nights lying awake, replaying conversations in my head, imagining different outcomes, and questioning what my next move should be. It felt like every option came with its own set of risks, its own kind of pain. Leaving Mike would mean unraveling 20 years of shared history, of memories, of a life we'd built together. It would mean breaking apart the family my children know and forcing them to adjust to a new reality. The thought of co-parenting, of dividing holidays and milestones, made my heart ache. How could I justify putting them through that when they didn't ask for any of this? On the other hand, staying meant continuing to live in a state of quiet dissatisfaction. It meant accepting that my needs would always come second, or maybe not even register at all. It meant teaching my children, whether intentionally or not, that it's okay to settle for less than you deserve. That realization was perhaps the hardest to confront. I didn't want them to grow up thinking this was what love looked like. Two people existing side by side, but never truly together. Then there was the third option, the one I kept circling back to, trying again. Could we fix this if I gave it one last effort? If I found the strength to push through the exhaustion, the resentment, the walls between us? Was there still something worth saving? I wasn't sure. And the thought of putting my heart back on the line, only to face more disappointment, felt unbearable. Each choice seemed impossibly hard, and no matter how much I analyzed them, I couldn't find a path that felt right. All I knew was that something had to change, whether it was in him, in our relationship, or in me. The only thing I couldn't do was stay frozen in this limbo forever. As the idea of making a final decision grew closer, I found myself consumed by its potential consequences. I kept replaying the scenarios in my mind, trying to predict how each one would ripple through our lives. Every possibility felt like a gamble, and the stakes, our family, our future, our happiness, couldn't be higher. If I stayed, I knew exactly what to expect. The routines would remain unchanged, the silences would grow heavier, and the disconnect would settle further into the cracks of our relationship. I feared I'd lose myself completely, slipping further into a role that no longer felt like my own. But at least the kids would have their version of stability, even if it came at the cost of my own. If I left, the unknown loomed large. What would life look like as a single parent? Could I handle the financial strain, the emotional toll, the inevitable questions from Ethan, Emma, and Lily? Would they resent me for disrupting their lives? Or would they, in time, come to understand that I did it to show them what it means to value yourself and demand the same from others? I thought about Mike too. Despite everything, I still cared for him. I didn't want to hurt him, but I couldn't ignore the hurt I was feeling in return. Leaving would force him to confront the reality of our situation, but would it make him reflect and change? Or would it push him further away? The weight of these possibilities was suffocating. No matter what I chose, someone would be hurt, and the life we'd known for so long would never be the same. But staying in this cycle wasn't living, it was surviving. And as much as I feared the consequences, I knew I had to choose something more. As I began to seriously consider the possibility of leaving, I found myself preparing in small, quiet ways. I didn't know if I had the courage to go through with it, but I needed to feel like I had options, that I wasn't trapped in a situation with no escape. It wasn't about making a definitive decision yet. It was about giving myself the tools to make one if the time came. I started by looking at the practical side of things. Could I afford to live on my own? What would custody look like for Ethan, Emma, and Lily? I opened a savings account in my name, putting away small amounts here and there just in case. It wasn't much, but it felt like a step toward independence, a safety net that might one day be needed. I also thought about emotional preparation. I began reaching out to friends more often, leaning on them for support in ways I hadn't before. I talked through my feelings, trying to untangle the knots of guilt, fear, and hope that had been building inside me for years. Their reassurance helped, but it didn't erase the weight of the decision ahead. Then there were the moments of reflection, sitting alone at the kitchen table after the kids were in bed, imagining what life might look like if I left. Would I feel relief, sadness, freedom? Could I create a new kind of happiness for myself and my children? Or would I spend every day wondering if I'd made a mistake? Even as I took these steps, I wasn't fully committed to leaving. Part of me still hoped Mike would notice the changes in me, that he'd step up and fight for our relationship. But I knew I couldn't count on that. For the first time in years, I was starting to think about my own future, not just as a wife and mother, but as an individual. And while the path ahead was uncertain, I was beginning to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time, the faintest glimmer of possibility. Throughout all my reflections, one thought has remained constant. My kids come first. Ethan, Emma, and Lily are my greatest joy, my strongest motivators, and the reason I've held on for as long as I have. Every decision I've contemplated, every conversation I've agonized over, has been filtered through the lens of what's best for them. But knowing what that means hasn't been easy. On one hand, staying together keeps their world intact. They get to wake up every day in the same house, with both parents under one roof. They don't have to endure the confusion of custody schedules or the awkwardness of explaining to their friends why mom and dad live apart. Stability is something I've always wanted to give them, and the thought of disrupting that feels like a failure. On the other hand, I wonder if what we have now is truly stable. They may not understand the nuances of our relationship, but I know they feel the tension. They see the way Mike and I barely speak, the lack of affection, the distance that has become our normal. What message am I sending them by staying? That love is supposed to be quiet and disconnected? That their mother's happiness doesn't matter? I think about the future, about the kind of adults they'll become. I want Ethan to grow up understanding how to treat a partner with respect and care. I want Emma and Lily to know their worth, to see their mother as someone who values herself enough to demand more from life. And I want all three of them to see that love, at its best, is about mutual effort and joy, not just endurance. Every choice I face feels like a compromise, but one thing is clear. Whatever I decide, it has to be with their well-being at the center. They deserve nothing less. The hardest part of this journey has been summoning the courage to make a decision. For so long, I've let fear guide me. Fear of the unknown, fear of failure, fear of breaking apart the family I've worked so hard to hold together. But the more I reflect on everything, the more I realize that staying out of fear isn't the same as staying out of love. It's not that I don't care for Mike. I do. He's been my partner for 2 decades, the father of my children, and someone I once loved deeply. But love, as I've come to understand, isn't always enough. Without effort, without reciprocity, without mutual respect, love can lose its shape, and what's left can feel like a shadow of what it once was. As I think about the future, I know the decision I make will change everything. Staying means continuing to live in a dynamic that feels unbalanced and unfulfilling, with the hope, however faint, that things might one day improve. Leaving means stepping into the unknown, risking pain and upheaval for the chance to rebuild a life that feels true to who I am. Neither option is easy. Both come with sacrifices, doubts, and consequences I'll have to face head-on. But I'm starting to realize that not choosing is its own kind of choice. Staying in limbo, stuck between hope and resignation, has been slowly eroding me. If I want something to change, I have to be the one to take the first step. What that step will be, I still don't fully know. But for the first time in a long time, I feel the stirrings of strength, the courage to choose, to act, to take control of my own story. It's there, waiting for me. And while the path forward isn't clear, I know that the hardest part is deciding to move at all. As I sit here, looking back on the journey that has brought me to this point, I feel a mix of emotions: sadness, gratitude, fear, and, most surprisingly, hope. The last 20 years with Mike have shaped so much of who I am. They've given me my children, countless memories, and lessons I never expected to learn. But they've also shown me the importance of balance, of listening to my own voice, and of recognizing when it's time to let go. I don't know exactly what lies up or to step away and create something new will ripple through every part of my life. It will shape my children's world, my identity, and the future I never imagined I'd be facing. But what I do know is that for the first time in years, I'm starting to see my own needs as valid. I'm starting to believe that my happiness matters just as much as anyone else's. This isn't about blaming Mike or painting him as the villain in our story. He's done his best in the ways he knows how, and I've loved him deeply for many of those years. But love isn't always enough, and sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to step back, whether it's to rebuild together or to let each other go. I want my children to look back one day and see that their mother made a choice, not out of fear or resignation, but out of strength and hope. Whether I stay or leave, I want them to know that love is meant to lift us up, not wear us down. So, as I take a deep breath and prepare for whatever comes next, I remind myself of one simple truth. I am allowed to choose myself, and no matter what happens, that choice will be the first step towards something better. Something I hope will finally feel like home.